Judge Margaret Thornton walked into Courtroom 4B that Tuesday morning, like she had done 1,000 times before. 15 years on the bench had taught her to expect almost anything, but it had also made her a bit impatient with people who wasted the court's time. She settled into her chair, adjusted her reading glasses, and flipped open the case file in front of her. The air conditioning hummed quietly overhead as people shuffled into their seats. Lawyers whispered to their clients. A few family members sat nervously in the gallery. Just another day at Riverside County Court. Margaret glanced at the next case on her list and let out a small sigh. Truancy violation, State versus Tommy Chen, a 17-year-old kid who'd skipped school too many times. She'd seen dozens of these cases. Usually it was the same story. Teenager thinks rules don't apply to them. Parents can't control them. Everyone ends up in court wasting taxpayer money. All rise for the Honorable Judge Thornton, the bailiff announced, though everyone was already standing. Please be seated, Margaret said, picking up her gavel. Bailiff, call the next case. Case number 2024 JV 8847, the State versus Tommy Chen. Margaret looked up, expecting to see a teenager walking in with a parent or guardian. Instead, she saw a kid who looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. He was small for his age, maybe 5'5" at most, with a round face that made him look even younger than 17. He wore a gray hoodie that was 2 sizes too big, faded jeans with a hole in one knee, and sneakers that had seen better days. His black hair stuck up in different directions like he'd forgotten to comb it. The boy walked slowly to the defendant's table, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked around the courtroom with wide eyes like a lost puppy trying to figure out where he was supposed to go. Margaret felt her irritation rising. This kid didn't even have the sense to dress appropriately for court. She'd seen this attitude before. Young people who thought the law was a joke, who didn't take anything seriously until it was too late. She waited for a moment, expecting to see an attorney walk in behind him. But no one came. The defendant's table remained empty except for the boy, who was now fumbling with his backpack, trying to pull out some papers. Young man, Judge Thornton said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmur of the courtroom. Where is your attorney? Tommy looked up at her. For a second, she saw what looked like fear in his eyes. Good, she thought. Maybe he'd finally realize this was serious. Your Honor, the boy said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. I'd like to represent myself today. The courtroom went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then came the laughter. It started with a chuckle from somewhere in the back row, then spread like wildfire. Even the court reporter cracked a smile. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Hayes who'd been checking his phone, looked up with an amused grin. Margaret didn't laugh, but she couldn't help the slight shake of her head. She banged her gavel twice. Order in the court, she said firmly. The laughter died down, but she could still see smirks on people's faces. She leaned forward and looked directly at Tommy. The boy was now staring at his shoes. His cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. Son, she began, using the tone she usually reserved for explaining things to people who clearly didn't understand how the world worked. Do you have any idea what you're doing? This is a court of law, not a playground. This isn't a video game or a TV show. I understand that, Your Honor, Tommy said quietly, still not making eye contact. Do you? Margaret raised her eyebrows. Because representing yourself in a legal proceeding is a serious matter. You're facing truancy charges. This goes on your permanent record. It could affect your ability to get into college, get certain jobs, get financial aid. Do you understand the consequences? The prosecutor stood up, still wearing that amused smile. Your Honor, if I may, perhaps we should appoint a public defender for the minor. It seems clear he doesn't understand the legal process. I agree, Mr. Hayes, Margaret said. She turned back to Tommy. Young man, I'm going to appoint you a lawyer, someone who actually knows what they're doing. We'll reschedule this hearing for next week when— Your Honor, with all due respect, Tommy interrupted, finally looking up at her. Something in his voice had changed. It was steadier now, more controlled. I'm aware of the gravity of these proceedings. I invoke my Sixth Amendment right to self-representation under Ferretta versus California. I'm prepared to proceed today, and I understand the risks of defending myself. Margaret froze, her hand hovering over her calendar. Did this kid just cite a Supreme Court case? She studied his face more carefully. His expression had changed. The nervous, embarrassed teenager from a moment ago seemed to have disappeared. His shoulders were straighter. His eyes met hers directly, without fear or arrogance, just quiet confidence. The courtroom had gone quiet again, but this time there was no laughter. People sensed something had shifted. Mr. Hayes wasn't smiling anymore either. He glanced at Tommy with a slight frown, as if seeing him for the first time. Margaret set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. In 15 years on the bench, she'd learned to trust her instincts. And right now her instincts were telling her that something very unusual was about to happen. "Very well," she said slowly, watching Tommy's face carefully. "But don't expect any special treatment, young man. If you want to represent yourself, you'll be held to the same standards as any attorney in this courtroom. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely." "All right then." Margaret turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Hayes, present your opening statement." As the prosecutor stood and began outlining the state's case, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. This kid had just quoted constitutional law like he'd been studying it for years. That wasn't normal. That wasn't normal at all. She watched Tommy carefully as he pulled out a yellow legal pad and began taking notes. His handwriting was neat and organized. He wrote quickly but methodically, underlining certain phrases, drawing arrows between different points. Margaret Thornton had made a lot of assumptions in her career. Most of the time she was right. But as she watched this teenager work, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, she'd made a serious mistake in judging this boy. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the prosecutor's statement. There would be time to figure out who this kid really was. For now, she had a job to do. Robert Hayes stood at his table looking far more confident than he had any reason not to be. After all, he was a prosecutor with 12 years of experience, facing off against a 17-year-old kid in an oversized hoodie. This was going to be the easiest case of his week. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, gesturing with the kind of practiced ease that comes from giving hundreds of opening statements. "The facts of this case are straightforward. Tommy Chen has missed 43 days of school this semester. 43 days. That's nearly a quarter of the academic year." He picked up a stack of papers and held them up for the judge to see. "We have attendance records from Lincoln High School showing every single absence. We have emails from teachers expressing concern. We have documentation from the principal's office showing multiple attempts to contact the family." Margaret watched Tommy as the prosecutor spoke. The boy was writing something on his legal pad, his face calm and focused. He didn't look nervous anymore. If anything, he looked like he was preparing for something. "Under California Education Code Section 48262, Hayes continued, warming to his argument, "a student is considered truant after missing 3 full days of school without a valid excuse. Mr. Chen has exceeded that threshold by over 14 times. The state takes truancy seriously because education is not optional. It's a fundamental right and responsibility." Hayes paused for effect, looking directly at Tommy. "We're not here to punish this young man. We're here to help him understand that actions have consequences, that rules exist for a reason, that he can't just skip school whenever he feels like it." Margaret nodded slightly. It was a solid opening. Clear, factual, reasonable. She'd heard variations of this speech dozens of times, and it usually worked because it was true.
Kids needed to go to school.
That was the law. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Does the defense wish to make an opening statement?" Tommy stood up slowly. He was so short that standing barely made him more visible behind the defendant's table. Someone in the back row snickered quietly. Margaret shot them a warning look. "Yes, Your Honor," Tommy said. His voice was different now, stronger, more deliberate. "If I may, proceed." Tommy walked around the table and stood in the space between his desk and the judge's bench. He didn't have any notes in his hands. He just stood there looking small but somehow not intimidated. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Hayes is correct that I missed 43 days of school this semester. I'm not here to dispute that fact. But what Mr. Hayes has presented is only half of the truth, and in a court of law we don't deal in half-truths. We deal in complete truth in context and justice." Margaret found herself leaning forward slightly. The way this kid spoke, it was like listening to someone much older, much more experienced. "The prosecution wants this court to believe that I'm just another lazy teenager who doesn't value education," Tommy continued. "But the evidence will show something very different. It will show that the school district failed to follow their own procedures. It will show that they violated state education codes meant to protect students in difficult situations. And it will show that sometimes missing school isn't about not caring. Sometimes it's about caring too much about something else, something more important than a desk and a chair. He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Hayes had stopped shuffling his papers. "I look forward to presenting the facts, Your Honor, all of the facts." Tommy returned to his seat. Margaret stared at him for a moment longer than she meant to. That wasn't the opening statement of a confused teenager. That was the opening statement of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Very well," she said, shaking off her surprise. "Mr. Hayes, call your first witness." The state calls Principal Anderson to the stand. A tall, tired-looking man in his 50s walked to the witness stand. He was sworn in and settled into the chair, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Hayes walked him through the basics. Yes, Tommy had been a student at Lincoln High for 3 years. Yes, his attendance had been excellent until this semester. Yes, the school had sent multiple notifications to his home address. Yes, they'd made phone calls. No, they never received responses. "And in your professional opinion, Principal Anderson," Hayes said, "is there any valid educational reason for a student to miss 43 days of school?" "No," the principal said firmly. "Absolutely not. We have procedures for students who are ill, who have family emergencies, who need accommodations. But Mr. Chen never followed any of those procedures. He just stopped showing up. Thank you." "No further questions." Hayes sat down, looking satisfied. Margaret turned to Tommy. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine?" "Yes, Your Honor." Tommy stood and picked up his legal pad. He walked toward the witness stand with the same calm confidence as before. Principal Anderson looked at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Principal Anderson," Tommy began, "you mentioned that the school has procedures for students who need accommodations. Can you tell the court what those procedures are?" The principal shifted in his seat. "Well, a parent or guardian needs to contact the school and fill out the appropriate forms. And what if a student doesn't have a parent or guardian available to make that contact? Then the student can speak with a counselor and we'll work with social services if needed." Tommy nodded, writing something down.
How many school counselors does Lincoln High have?
3. "And how many students attend Lincoln High?" "About 2,000. So that's roughly 667 students per counselor. Would you say your counselors are generally available whenever a student needs them?" Principal Anderson frowned. "They do their best. They're very busy." "I'm sure they are," Tommy said. "Now you testified that the school sent notifications to my home address. Do you know who lives at that address?" "I assume you and your parents. Did you verify that?" "We sent the letters to the address on file." Tommy walked back to his table and picked up a piece of paper. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into evidence. It's a copy of my student registration form from 3 years ago." Margaret examined the document. It listed an address and 2 parent names. "Principal Anderson," Tommy continued, "when was the last time anyone from the school verified that this information was still current?" The principal was quiet for a moment. "I'd have to check our records. I can save you the trouble." "The answer is never. My mother passed away when I was 14. My father left before I was born. For the past year and a half, I've been living with my grandmother at a completely different address. The school has been sending all correspondence to an empty apartment." A murmur went through the courtroom. Hayes sat up straighter, suddenly looking less confident. "You said the school made phone calls," Tommy went on. "To what number?" "The number on file, which is a disconnected cell phone that belonged to my mother. A phone that hasn't worked in 3 years. Principal Anderson's face was turning red. "We followed our standard procedures. Did you?" Tommy's voice was sharp now. "Because according to California Education Code Section 4826005, schools are required to make a conscientious effort to meet with parents before filing truancy charges." "Did anyone from Lincoln High make a conscientious effort to find me? To understand why I was missing school? Or did you just check boxes on a form and call it good enough?" "We did everything we're required to do," the principal said defensively. "No, sir," Tommy said quietly. "You did the minimum." "There's a difference." Margaret found herself nodding slightly before she caught herself. This kid had just torn apart the school's entire case in less than 10 minutes. And he'd done it with precision, with facts, with the kind of legal reasoning that most adults couldn't manage. Hayes was frantically writing notes, his confidence completely evaporated. The smirks in the courtroom had disappeared. Everyone was watching Tommy with new eyes. "No further questions," Tommy said, returning to his seat. Margaret looked at the clock. They'd only been in session for 30 minutes, but she felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She'd walked into this courtroom thinking she knew exactly how this case would go. She'd been very, very wrong. Margaret called for a 15-minute recess. She needed a moment to collect her thoughts, and honestly, she needed to figure out what was really going on with this case. As soon as she reached her chambers, she sat down at her computer and pulled up Tommy's file. She'd glanced at it earlier, but only briefly. Now she needed to see everything. What she found made her stop breathing for a second. Tommy Chen. Age 17. But that was just the beginning. She scrolled down, her eyes widening with each line. Took the LSAT at 16. Scored a perfect 180. Not just a good score, a perfect score. Only 0.1% of test takers ever achieved that. She kept reading. Accepted to Harvard Law School with a full scholarship. Granted special permission to audit law school courses online while finishing high school. And then, the line that made her put her hand over her mouth. Passed the California bar exam on first attempt at age 17. Margaret sat back in her chair, feeling like someone had just pulled the rug out from under her. This wasn't just some smart kid. This was a legal prodigy, someone who could already practice law if he wanted to, someone who probably knew more about courtroom procedure than half the attorneys who appeared before her. And she'd mocked him. Called him son in that condescending tone. Treated him like he was wasting everyone's time. She thought back to the laughter in the courtroom when he'd said he wanted to represent himself, the smirks from the prosecutor, her own dismissive comments about playgrounds and video games. Her cheeks burned with shame. She looked at the clock. 10 more minutes until they had to go back. She pulled up more information, trying to understand the full picture. There were medical records attached to the file. She clicked on them. Hospital records for Grace Chen, age 74. Tommy's grandmother, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Treatment schedule showing chemotherapy appointments, dozens of them, and every single one matched a day that Tommy had missed school. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. This kid hadn't been skipping school to hang out with friends or play video games. He'd been taking care of his dying grandmother. The only family he had left, she found more documents. Letters from Tommy to the school district, dated 4 months ago, requesting homeschooling accommodations. Clear, well-written letters explaining his situation, asking for help. There was no record of any response. She found another letter, this one from a social worker, confirming Tommy's situation and recommending that the school work with him to create a flexible attendance plan. Again, no response on file. The school hadn't just failed to follow procedures. They'd ignored a kid who was desperately trying to do the right thing. A kid who was caring for his dying grandmother, while somehow managing to pass the bar exam and get into one of the best law schools in the country. Margaret closed the files and pressed, her palms against her eyes. In 15 years on the bench, she'd always prided herself on being fair, on seeing the truth beneath the surface. But today, she'd judged a book by its cover. She'd seen a teenager in a hoodie and made assumptions, and she'd been completely wrong. The knock on her door told her it was time to go back. She took a deep breath, straightened her robe, and walked back to the courtroom. But everything felt different now. She wasn't walking back to oversee a simple truancy case. She was walking back to watch a masterclass in law from someone who could teach her a thing or two. When she took her seat, she noticed the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. People were sitting up straighter. The whispers had stopped. Everyone was focused on Tommy, who sat at his table reviewing his notes with the concentration of a chess player planning his next move. "Court is back in session," Margaret announced. "Mr. Hayes, you may call your next witness." The prosecutor stood, but he looked uncertain now. The confidence from earlier had vanished. "Your Honor, the state would like to enter into evidence the attendance records from Lincoln High School showing the defendant's absences." Tommy stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Foundation." Margaret raised her eyebrows. "Explain." "The prosecution hasn't established that these records are accurate or complete. They haven't shown the proper chain of custody. And they haven't addressed the fact that the school's record-keeping system has documented errors, including incorrect student addresses and contact information. As we've already established." Hayes looked flustered. "Your Honor, these are official school records." "That doesn't make them automatically admissible," Tommy said calmly. "Under California Evidence Code Section 1280, business records must be kept in the ordinary course of business and made at or near the time of the event. Given that the school couldn't even maintain current contact information for students, how can we trust that their attendance records are accurate? Margaret had to bite her lip to keep from smiling. The kid was absolutely right. Objection sustained. Mr. Hayes, you need to establish proper foundation before entering these records. Hayes looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. He called an attendance clerk to the stand, a nervous woman who admitted under Tommy's questioning that yes, sometimes the attendance system glitched. Yes, sometimes teachers forgot to take attendance. Yes, there had been occasions where students were marked absent when they were actually present. By the time Tommy was done, the prosecution's evidence looked less like solid proof and more like Swiss cheese. Full of holes, Your Honor, Hayes said, looking defeated. The state rests. Very well, Margaret said. Does the defense wish to present evidence? Tommy stood. Yes, Your Honor, I'd like to call myself to testify. This was unusual but not illegal. Margaret nodded. Tommy walked to the witness stand and was sworn in. Then he returned to his table and began questioning himself, a strange but effective legal technique. He walked the court through everything. His grandmother's cancer diagnosis, the decision to move in with her because she had no one else, the chemotherapy appointments that happened during school hours because that was the only time the oncologist could see her, the letters he'd written to the school begging for help, letters that were never answered. He produced hospital records, medication schedules, doctor's notes. Everything was organized, labeled, documented. Every piece of evidence told the same story. A kid doing everything he possibly could to take care of the person he loved while still trying to maintain his education. I didn't want to miss school, Tommy said, and for the first time, his voice cracked slightly with emotion. I loved learning. But I loved my grandmother more. And she needed me. She was scared and sick and alone, and I was all she had. So yes, I missed school, and I'd do it again because that's what family does. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a moment. Tommy pulled out more documents. Printouts showing he'd completed all his coursework online. Test scores showing he'd maintained a 4.0 grade point average despite everything. Letters from his teachers saying his work was excellent and that he'd gone above and beyond to stay caught up. I wasn't skipping school to be lazy, he said. I was making an impossible choice. And I did everything I could to keep learning while taking care of the person who raised me. He returned to his seat. Hayes didn't even attempt to cross-examine. What could he possibly say? Margaret looked at the young man sitting at the defense table. Not a kid in a hoodie, not a troublemaker, just a 17-year-old who'd been forced to become an adult far too soon. Someone who'd had to choose between two things that both mattered, and who'd done his best to honor both. She thought about her initial reaction to him. The condescension, the mockery, the assumptions. She'd never felt smaller in her life. Margaret looked down at her notes, but the words were blurring together. She'd been a judge for 15 years. She'd heard thousands of cases. She'd seen people lie, cry, make excuses, tell the truth, but she'd never seen anything quite like this. Tommy sat at the defense table waiting. His hoodie was still too big. His sneakers were still worn. But Margaret didn't see those things anymore. She saw a young man who'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders and somehow still managed to stand tall. Does the defense wish to make a closing argument? She asked, though her voice was softer than it had been at the start. Tommy stood. He didn't walk to the center of the room this time. He just stood at his table and spoke directly to the judge. Your Honor, the law exists to serve justice, not the other way around. California Education Code requires children to attend school, and that's a good law. Education matters. It changes lives. I know that better than anyone. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But the law also recognizes that life is complicated. That's why there are exceptions for illness, for family emergencies, for circumstances beyond a student's control. The school district had the power to work with me. They had my letters asking for help. They had documentation from medical professionals. They had everything they needed to create a plan that would have worked for everyone. Tommy picked up a piece of paper from his table. Instead, they did nothing, and when doing nothing didn't solve their problem, they brought charges against a student who was doing his best in an impossible situation. That's not justice, Your Honor. That's bureaucracy hiding behind the law instead of serving it. He set the paper down. I'm not asking this court to say that truancy doesn't matter. I'm asking this court to recognize that sometimes there are things that matter more. And I'm asking this court to hold institutions accountable when they fail the very people they're supposed to serve. Tommy sat down. The courtroom remained silent. Margaret turned to Hayes. "Does the prosecution wish to make a closing argument?" Hayes stood slowly. He looked like a man who knew he'd already lost but had to go through the motions anyway. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped. He looked at his notes, then at Tommy, then back at the judge.
"Your Honor, the state acknowledges that Mr. Chen's circumstances were extraordinary."
"And we acknowledge that the school district's response was inadequate." Margaret's eyebrows went up. A prosecutor admitting weakness in his own case wasn't common. Hayes continued, "The state's intention was never to punish someone for taking care of a sick family member. Our intention was to address what appeared to be a truancy issue. But it's clear now that this was never simple truancy. This was a young man caught between two duties, both important, and forced to make an impossible choice." He picked up his folder and closed it. "The state has no further arguments." "Your Honor, it wasn't quite a concession, but it was close." Margaret nodded slowly. She took a moment to look at everyone in the courtroom. The people in the gallery who'd been smirking earlier now looked thoughtful. The court reporter was watching with obvious sympathy. Even the bailiff, who usually maintained perfect professional detachment, looked moved. Margaret cleared her throat. "Mr. Chen, would you please stand?" Tommy stood. He looked smaller than ever behind that big table, but he stood straight and met her eyes. Margaret had to choose her words carefully. What she said next would matter, not just for this case, but for this young man's future. "Mr. Chen, I owe you an apology. When you first walked into this courtroom, I made assumptions based on your appearance and your age. I was dismissive. I was condescending, and I was wrong." She saw surprise flicker across Tommy's face. "The law degree you've earned, the bar exam you've passed, the academic achievements you've accomplished, those are remarkable. But that's not why I'm apologizing. I'm apologizing because every person who enters this courtroom deserves to be treated with respect and fairness, regardless of their credentials or appearance. You deserved that from the moment you walked in, and I failed to give it to you." The courtroom was so quiet that Margaret could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "Your legal skills are exceptional," she continued. "But more importantly, your understanding of what the law should be, what justice really means. That's something that many attorneys practice for decades without truly grasping. You said the law should serve justice, not the other way around." "That's exactly right." She looked down at the case file, then back at Tommy. "You've shown this court that you missed school not out of disrespect for education, but because you were honoring something fundamental to our humanity, taking care of family. You documented your situation. You reached out for help. You continued your education despite impossible circumstances. And you maintained excellence in your academic work." Margaret paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. The school district, on the other hand, failed to follow their own procedures. They ignored correspondence from a student in crisis. They didn't verify basic contact information. They made no genuine effort to understand or address your situation before filing charges. That's not just poor administration. That's a failure of their fundamental duty to serve students. She picked up her gavel, but didn't bang it yet. "Therefore, I'm dismissing all charges against Tommy Chen with prejudice, which means they cannot be brought again. These charges will be expunged from your record completely. As far as the law is concerned, this case never happened." Relief flooded Tommy's face, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm ordering the school district to review and revise their truancy intervention procedures within 60 days. They will establish a clear protocol for students facing family medical emergencies. They will implement a system to verify student contact information at least once per semester, and they will create a position dedicated to helping students in crisis situations access resources and accommodations." She looked at Principal Anderson, who was still sitting in the gallery. "The district will submit their new procedures to this court for review. If I find them inadequate, I'll order additional reforms. Our schools should be helping students like Mr. Chen, not prosecuting them." Now she raised her gavel. "But before I close this case, I have one question for you, Mr. Chen." Tommy looked at her, waiting. "Why didn't you tell us who you were from the beginning? Why let everyone underestimate you? Why not just show your credentials and avoid this whole situation?" Tommy was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was clear and thoughtful. "Your Honor, I could have walked in here and announced that I passed the bar exam. I could have made sure everyone knew my credentials before we started. But that would have proven the wrong thing. It would have proven that people listen when you have impressive titles and degrees. It would have said that justice depends on who you are, not what's right. He glanced around the courtroom. Every person who comes before this court deserves fair treatment. The single mother working 2 jobs who can't get time off for court dates. The immigrant who doesn't speak perfect English. The kid from a poor neighborhood who can't afford a good lawyer. They don't have Harvard acceptance letters to make people take them seriously, but their stories matter just as much as mine. Tommy's voice grew stronger. My grandmother used to tell me that the law should be a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the powerful. I wanted to show that even without credentials, even when you look like someone people don't take seriously, the truth still matters. Justice should still win, because if justice only works for people with advantages, then it's not really justice at all. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, but she knew people had seen. This 17-year-old kid had just taught her more about justice than she'd learned in 15 years on the bench. Margaret banged her gavel, but gently this time. Almost reverently, "This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the courtroom, but nobody moved right away. It felt like everyone needed a moment to process what they'd just witnessed. This hadn't been just another truancy case. It had been something else entirely. A lesson, a revelation, a reminder of what the legal system was supposed to be about. Tommy gathered his papers slowly, carefully placing them back into his worn backpack. His hands were shaking slightly now that it was over. The adrenaline was wearing off, and he was just a tired 17-year-old again. Margaret watched him from the bench. She wanted to say something more, but she wasn't sure what. Sorry seemed too small. Thank you seemed wrong. What do you say to someone who just changed the way you see your own job? As Tommy zipped up his backpack and turned to leave, she made a decision. "Mr. Chen," she called out. "Could you approach the bench, please?" Tommy looked up surprised. He walked forward, and Margaret gestured for him to come closer. When he was near enough that others couldn't easily hear, she spoke quietly. "I meant what I said about the apology. I really am sorry for how I treated you." Tommy nodded. "I understand, Your Honor, you didn't know." "That's not an excuse," Margaret said firmly. "I should have known better. I should have been better." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, it's your grandmother." "When did she pass?" Tommy's composure cracked slightly. His eyes got wet, though he didn't cry. "Last Tuesday." 6 days ago. Margaret felt her heart break a little. "I'm so sorry. And here you are dealing with all of this." "She would have wanted me to be here," Tommy said softly. "She always said that you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She raised you well." "She raised me with love," Tommy said. "Everything else came from that." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak for a moment. Then she cleared her throat. "I have a question for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. You don't have to decide now." Tommy waited, curious. "When you finish law school, when you start practicing, this jurisdiction could use someone like you. Not just because you're brilliant, though you obviously are, but because you understand something that a lot of lawyers forget. You understand that behind every case file, there's a human being. Someone with a story. Someone who deserves to be heard." She leaned forward slightly. "We need public defenders who actually care. We need prosecutors who seek justice, not just convictions. We need attorneys who remember why the law exists in the first place. I think you could be that kind of lawyer. So if you're interested, I'd be honored to write you a recommendation. And if you decide to practice here after graduation, I'd be honored to see you in my courtroom. On the right side of the bench this time." Tommy looked stunned. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything now. Just think about it. You've got time." Margaret smiled slightly. "Though not too much time. Harvard's going to keep you busy." "Thank you, Your Honor. Really, that means more than you know." As Tommy walked away, Margaret saw Hayes, the prosecutor, waiting near the door. She wondered if there was going to be another confrontation. But Hayes didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. "That was impressive," Hayes said to Tommy, extending his hand. "I've been doing this for 12 years, and you just taught me things I should have learned a long time ago." Tommy shook his hand, looking surprised. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone." "I know," Hayes said. "That's what makes it even more impressive. You were just trying to tell the truth." He glanced back at the empty courtroom. "For what it's worth, I'm going to recommend that my office review how we handle truancy cases. You're right. We should be helping kids, not prosecuting them." "That would be good." Tommy said quietly. Hayes nodded and left. Tommy stood in the hallway for a moment, alone with his thoughts. The weight of the past few months, the past few days, the past few hours, it all settled on him at once. His grandmother was gone. The court case was over. He was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. But he'd done it. He'd stood up for himself. He'd stood up for what was right. And maybe, just maybe, he'd made things a little better for the next kid who would face a similar situation. He walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun. His phone buzzed with a text from his roommate at the group home where he was staying temporarily. "Just checking if you're okay? How did it go?" Tommy typed back, "Case dismissed. I'll tell you everything when I get home." As he walked to the bus stop, he thought about his grandmother. She'd been so proud when he got into Harvard, so proud when he passed the bar exam. She'd fought to stay alive long enough to see him graduate high school. Even though the cancer was killing her, she'd made it to his graduation by 3 days. He wished she could have been in that courtroom today. She would have been proud of him, not for winning, but for speaking truth, for standing up, for remembering what she'd taught him about justice and dignity and treating people right. The bus arrived and Tommy climbed on. He found a seat near the back and stared out the window as the courthouse disappeared behind him. In a few months, he'd be starting at Harvard. In a few years, he'd be back in courtrooms like this one, fighting for people who needed someone in their corner. But he'd never forget today. Never forget the feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, mocked. It would make him a better lawyer. It would remind him to see people, really see them, not just their appearance or their circumstances. Back in her chambers, Margaret sat at her desk, staring at nothing. She pulled up Tommy's file again and read through it one more time. 17 years old. No parents. No family left except a grandmother who'd just died. Living in a group home. And still, he'd managed to accomplish more than most people do in a lifetime. She thought about all the cases she'd heard over the years. How many times had she made snap judgments? How many times had she let appearances cloud her thinking? How many people had stood before her bench and been dismissed, underestimated, not taken seriously? She couldn't change the past, but she could change the future. She opened a new document on her computer and started typing. A memo to all attorneys who practiced in her court. New standards. New expectations. A reminder that every person who entered her courtroom deserved respect and a fair hearing, regardless of how they looked or who they were. And then she wrote something else. A letter of recommendation for Tommy Chen. She didn't know if he'd ever ask for it, but she wanted it ready. She wanted him to know that someone believed in him. Someone saw not just his brilliance, but his character. As the sun set outside her window, Margaret realized that she'd been changed by what happened today. That scared kid in the oversized hoodie had walked into her courtroom and reminded her why she'd become a judge in the first place. Not to wield power. Not to check boxes. Not to move through cases as quickly as possible. To seek truth. To serve justice. To see the humanity in every person who stood before her. She saved the letter and closed her computer. Tomorrow, there would be more cases. More people with problems and stories and needs. But she